Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar sponsored by the HIBAR Research Alliance, also known as the HRA, and produced in collaboration with the University of British Columbia and Foundations for Social Change. I'm Scott Slovic from the University of Idaho, and I'll be the moderator for today's one-hour event. This is the 11th in our series of webinars for researchers, research administrators, and others who are interested in what we call highly integrative, basic, and responsive research. Our previous webinars are now available for viewing on the HRA website, which can be found at hibar-research.org. Before our featured presentation by Jiaying Zhao and Alice Hopkins, I'd like to explain the structure of today's meeting. We'll begin with a brief overview of the HIBAR research concept by Dr. Lauren Whitehead. Next, Jiaying and Alice will speak about the HIBAR aspects of the New Leaf project for about 20 minutes. We'll then have approximately 20 to 25 minutes for Q&A, followed by an opportunity for our presenters to offer a few final takeaways. And now let's get started. Dr. Lauren Whitehead, the director of the HIBAR Research Alliance, is a professor in the Department of Physics and Astronomy at the University of British Columbia. He'll briefly introduce the concept of HIBAR research and the HRA organization. Lauren?
Thank you very much, Scott. I'll try to get my screen sharing going. Great. Well, it's a pleasure to have just a few minutes to introduce the very interesting conversations that we'll be having today. I'll be answering these two questions, beginning with the first. What is HIBAR research? Well, HIBAR, first of all, is an acronym for highly integrative, basic, and responsive, and I'll explain those words momentarily. The key thing is it's a long-valued form of powerful research projects intended to create knowledge and solve societal problems, jointly led by academic and societal experts. And I'm going to expand on those two words, and. So one way to do that is to think about a relationship or Venn diagram. We're not going to spend much time on this figure, but it's kind of a pictorial representation of how two ideas can combine. In this case, the idea of research being discovery-oriented with the idea of it having public impact. So those are two different colors, and where they overlap, that gray zone has both of those characteristics. So we can make a similar distinction in a different way by talking about projects that combine academic leadership with societal leadership, leadership by people in society. And again, the overlap zone in this case is portrayed as gray. And when we look at both of those dualities together, we can identify HIBAR research in that central zone. So HIBAR research projects are projects that have all four of those characteristics that are shown in the picture. And we use the words highly integrative and basic and responsive to kind of represent those dualities, and also very important synergies, which I will now describe. So basically, these deep integrations yield synergy that boosts discovery and generates better solutions. And there are two primary reasons related to the two combinations. Regarding co-leadership, the trusting and equitable partnership of leaders from both academia and society combines diverse perspectives, yielding wiser decisions about project direction and activities, starting from the project's conception and through to its conclusion. This is the key distinguishing characteristic of HIBAR projects in comparison to other kinds of use-inspired basic research projects. So it's a very important characteristic to bear in mind, and we'll hear much more about it today. The second duality is that of dual purpose, as mentioned before. Knowledge creation, when combined with societal problem solving, leads project teams to draw from a wider set of knowledge and skills and to employ a broader gamut of problem solving methods. So those two things make HIBAR powerful. What we're trying to do to make HIBAR more common is to work with an organization or through an organization that we call the HIBAR Research Alliance. So the nature of the alliance and its mission are as follows. First of all, we are a distributed network of experienced volunteers who are well organized and united in their support of HIBAR research. And we have an aim to increase the prevalence of university HIBAR research from about one project in 20, which we think is about the rate within universities today, to about 1 in 5 by the year 2030, while improving all types of research. So nothing will be made worse, but we think there'll be significant increase to all kinds of research by increasing the prevalence of HIBAR. So this will help universities to respond more effectively to societal needs while also increasing the excellence of their fundamental research. Now, today, we have a very exciting opportunity with the project we're about to hear about, and it's just a beautiful, in my feeling, a beautiful example of HIBAR research. First of all, it absolutely is discovery oriented. There is a goal to develop deeper understanding, in this case, of homelessness and specifically the impact of direct giving on those experiencing homelessness. Secondly, with regard to public impact, this work is intended to help the participants and to the participants in the project, and to help expand efforts to reduce the societal consequences of homelessness. So clearly, both of those orientations are strongly present, as you will see. And with regard to co-leadership, we have a leader from society who will be speaking with us today outside the academic system. So we have that co-leadership characteristic, which brings deep understanding, in this case, of the challenges of homelessness. And of course, we have academic co-leadership. This work is co-led by expert academics, one of whom we'll hear from today, who are experts in both the experimental methodologies and also the multiple associated psychological phenomena. So it's a wonderful HIBAR project. I'm so glad to be able to introduce it today. And Scott, on that note, I'd like to hand back to you.
Thanks very much, Lauren. And I'm very glad that in your overview, you really put heavy emphasis on co-leadership. And we're delighted to have two speakers today, Jiaying Zhao and Alice Hopkins. Jiaying is an associate professor and Canada Research Chair in the Department of Psychology and the Institute for Resources, Environment and Sustainability at the University of British Columbia. And Alice is the program manager at Foundations for Social Change. And today they'll discuss the New Leaf project, which studies the impact of unconditional cash transfers to individuals experiencing homelessness. And now over to you, Jiaying and Alice.
Thank you so much, Scott, and Lauren, and Michelle for the invitation. It's a pleasure to talk about our work today at HIBAR. It's a privilege to present to this audience and be considered as a HIBAR research. So I'm Jiaying, you can call me JZ for short. And with me is Alice Hopkins, who's the program manager at Foundations for Social Change. So this is our team that consists of academic researchers and industry leaders. So this project is not possible without these individuals. So Ryan Dwyer, who's my PhD student at UBC, and Dr. Anita Pelapu, who's the co-investigator on this project. Again, she's also a professor in the Department of Medicine at UBC. And Alice, over to you to introduce FSC leaders.
Sure. So at FSC, we have Claire Williams, who was our co-founder and is our co-founder. We now also have Heather Hay, who has an extensive healthcare charity sector background, and she is the acting CEO currently. And then we have Hani Lee, who has been on the project from very early stage and is our program coordinator and also our kind of community engagement lead as well.
Thank you, Alice. So we are tackling a critical issue in Canada and US, which is homelessness. It's a growing socioeconomic and health challenge in Canada. So on every given night, 35,000 people experience homelessness as a result of evictions, job loss, domestic violence, mental health issues, and addictions. In any given year, about 250,000 individuals experience homelessness. And this presents a significant cost to the government and to society. So every year, it costs anywhere from $55,000 to $130,000 per person to run social services and health care and justice services. This is a very costly status quo that we are kind of just accepting by default. And the picture is very similar in the US. Of course, the population is bigger because of the bigger population in the US. And the shocking factor is almost 200,000 children are homeless on a given night. And that's just not acceptable. So what are the existing approaches to homelessness? These are kind of the current standard approaches. One is providing emergency services, such as shelters. Another one is providing healthcare services, such as detox treatment and rehab centers. And another popular approach is permanent supportive housing, such as housing first approach. And these approaches are adopted by countries around the world to address homelessness. But ironically, these approaches do not tackle the core cause of homelessness, which is the lack of money. In fact, which I'll show in a second, a prevalent reason for becoming homeless is simply not being able to pay rent. And so I think this is a motivation for us to try out our approach, which is to use unconditional cash transfers to reduce homelessness. Now, this approach has been proven effective to reduce global poverty. And for instance, in developing countries, unconditional cash transfers have been shown to improve psychological well-being. This includes life satisfaction and affective outcomes, health conditions, financial management strategies. This includes investments and purchasing of durable goods, food security and increasing assets, and finally, educational and employment outcomes. And a review of 30 studies coming from the developing world shows a slight reduction on temptation goods spending after cash transfers. So what are these spending? Temptation goods refer to, in these studies, alcohol, tobacco, and gambling. And so contrary to a lot of people's predictions, after getting the cash, recipients actually reduce their spending on these temptation goods. And this is exactly what we found as well, which I will demonstrate in a second. So this is kind of the broader literature review on cash transfers. And I think that gave rise to the New Leaf project. So Alice, over to you to briefly describe this project.
Thanks. So this project was co-founded by Claire and Franz, who you can see there, and really was inspired by a couple of things. So a TED talk by the historian Rutger Bregman about basic income, and also a very small project which was actually started in the UK, London, which involved a group of chronically homeless men who received unconditional cash transfers, and the results were really promising. They weren't academically evaluated. There was a lot of promise. And so that's really what inspired the two co-founders to really ask, well, given the circumstances in Canada, what would it look like to try this here? And so really the mission of the New Leaf project as it was first born was to really use unconditional cash transfers to empower individuals to move beyond homelessness, improve the overall quality of their lives, and really to shift what we saw was really an entrenched understanding in society that, you know, being homeless is not a character defect, it's a circumstance. And unconditional cash transfers were really a way to recognize that.
Thank you, Alice. So this is the kind of the evolution of this New Leaf project. So as Alice mentioned, the New Leaf project was born in 2015. And I think Claire and Franz did extensive consultations with community partners since then. And in 2016, they were introduced to me by Rob Turnbull from the Street to Home Foundation. So this is when we connected, and I jumped on board immediately with Claire to take the lead on the research design and basically the scientific execution of this project. So in 2016, I formally joined the New Leaf project as an academic partner, and we co-designed the entire project as a team after that. So as you can see from this timeline, since then, we brought more partners on board. We brought on 4 shelter partners. We actually received a grant from the federal government of Canada, which is actually a division of Employment and Social Development Canada. They gave us $500,000 as initial funding. That kickstarted the whole fundraising campaign, and we secured more funding from McConnell Foundation, from Kathleen Donnelly Foundation, and Power to Give Foundations to basically to have the financial basis to run this project. On top of that, we got Van City on board, who gave us free checking accounts for our participants, where we can e-transfer participants a cash transfer. We also got the permission from the province of British Columbia to run this pilot, where our participants can keep the cash transfer and still remain eligible for income assistance. So basically, we avoided the benefit cliffs that are commonly seen in the US. And in early 2018, that's when we launched the first wave of data collection of the New Leaf project. That continued 4 waves in total. In the middle of 2019, the recruitment was officially done, and the project wrapped up in 2020 after the 1-year follow-up with all participants. And also late 2019, we got the board approval from Foundations for Social Change to run the expansion project. that Alice will describe later. Okay, so this is how we work together from the UBC research team and the New Leaf project team. So for the research team, which is me and Mayan and Anita, we're responsible for overseeing the research project, getting ethics approval from UBC, collecting data, running data analysis, and writing reports. So we're supervising the research component of the project. Whereas for the FSC team, I think Alice and your team are responsible for fundraising, partnership building, hiring staff, and coordinating interviewers or connectors to collect data. And jointly, we're responsible for the entire project design and execution. So we meet on a weekly basis, sometimes more often when needed. For COVID, we will meet in one room, the office, to discuss project progress, to problem shoot any issues that arise in that given week. We co-present to partner organizations, for policymakers, and we celebrate project milestones. And we also support each other. That's the most important aspect of our meetings. So this is the randomized control trial that we ran on the New Leaf project. And we asked, what is the impact of this one-time unconditional cash transfer on recently homeless individuals? So this RCT involved a one-time cash transfer of $7,500, this is Canadian dollars, to their checking accounts of the 50 individuals who are recently homeless in Vancouver, with another 65 individuals as controls. And the reason we chose $7,500 is that it was the annual income assistance in British Columbia back in 2016 when we finalized the project design. So we think that this cash transfer provides greater financial freedom to empower people to exercise their choice and control over their life, to propel themselves to move beyond homelessness. And we're tracking their life outcomes over 1 year at these time points after the cash transfer. And if you want, actually, we have our manuscript print available online. So these are our key partner organizations. That's the province, British Columbia, Vancity, who kindly gave us free checking accounts for participants, and the 4 shelter organizations across the Lower Mainland. So this is kind of the spatial distribution of the shelters across the Lower Mainland in Vancouver. And within each kind of hub of shelters, we have Vancity branches to provide checking accounts for participants to access the cash transfer. So here's our screening criteria. We'll first get referrals from the shelter based on age and the duration of homelessness. They have to be homeless for less than 2 years at the time of recruitment, and they have to be a Canadian citizen or permanent resident. On top of that, we screened participants on their substance use, so they cannot exhibit severe levels of substance use. So on that criteria, 55% of participants pass. We also screen participants on alcohol use, so they cannot have severe levels of alcohol use, and 87% of participants passed that criterion. And finally, they cannot have severe levels of psychiatric symptoms, so 74% of participants passed that criterion. So jointly, we screened over 700 participants, and about a third of them passed all criteria among those we screened. And among the people who passed, 115 participants completed the baseline survey. So they are successfully enrolled into the study. And obviously, when we conducted the screening survey, there was no mention of cash. It was run under a cover story. No one was aware of the cash transfer. So this is our participant sample over time. So at baseline, that's 115 to start. And at 12 months, we were able to retain over 50% of the individuals. And here are the dropout reasons. So most of them are just, we lost contact of them. This is a highly transient sample of people. They didn't have a stable address. Many of them didn't have phones. So it's very easy to lose contact with them despite our best efforts. And a few participants withdrew from the study. And we also lost several participants due to death, unfortunately. But the reason was unrelated to the cash transfer or the project. So this is our final sample of participants. Their average age is 42 years old. About 40% were female. A third of them had dependents. 12% were Indigenous. And their average duration of homelessness was about 6 months. About a quarter had no personal ID. And around a third of them had some form of employment. And this is their reason, their self-reported reason for homelessness. So as you can see, the most prevalent reason for being homeless is being evicted by the landlord. So they can check multiple reasons. So this is not just one choice. And the most common reason for eviction is just financial constraints, not being able to pay rent. There are some people who've had to flee from domestic violence. That was very common in women in our sample. So these are kind of our ranking of reasons for homelessness in our sample. And here are the results of this RCT. This is at 12 months. So here I'm showing on the left, I'm showing you in overall treatment effects, as in standard deviations of the cash group compared to the control group at the 12 months follow-up time point. This is also controlling for baseline differences between the cash and control group. And what I'm showing you here is all the outcomes that we track over time, from housing stability to service use at the end. And the solid black bars mean that the effect was significant at 0.05 level. The gray bars are insignificant, and the arrow bars represent 95% confidence intervals. So as you can see from this graph, we have some significant findings, even though the sample was small to start with. The cash recipients spent fewer days homeless. They had more savings at 12 months. They increased their spending at 12 months. Importantly, there was no increase in temptation goods spending. That includes alcohol, drugs, and cigarettes. And there was also significant cost savings from reduced reliance on social services. So these are kind of the main findings and key kind of takeaways from our study. Now I'm going to get into just a bit more details of what each domain looked like. This is days homeless from our participants, from the cash group and the non-cash group over 1 year, from baseline to 12 months. So over the course of 1 year, cash recipients spent 99 fewer days homeless. And that difference was significant at 1 month after the cash transfer. So what this suggests is that immediately after the cash transfer, people were able to move out of the shelter and move out of the streets. To us, that was incredible. We did not expect this because the average time people spend in the shelter is about 6 months. They have to wait in line for 6 months to get stable housing. And that's why you also see the control group, declining over time. That's just the natural progression of the shelter system in Vancouver. But importantly, the cash group was able to decrease at a much rapid rate than the non-cash group. This is savings. This is dollars saved at every time point. And over the course of 1 year, cash recipients retained more savings. Actually, this is over $1,000 over 1 year compared to the control group. So this, again, was very promising for us. This also challenges the assumption people have about individuals experiencing homelessness, that they if they get the cash, they're going to spend it right away. That was not the case. We looked at their spending per month. This is basically how much they spend every month at each touch point. And cash recipients actually spent more money on durable goods. So these involve furniture, cars, computers, phones, for instance. They also spend more money on rent, food, and transit compared to the non-cash participants. And importantly, we did not see an increase in spending on temptation goods. So these are alcohol, drugs, and cigarette spending. And as you can see, over the course of 1 year, cash recipients actually decreased their spending on temptation goods, whereas for the non-cash participants, their spending fluctuated over time. And this, again, challenged the widespread assumption that people who are homeless will spend money on drugs and alcohol if given cash. Again, that was not the case in our sample. And this is the final results slide. This is the cost savings as a function of reduced time in the shelter. This graph is basically how much money the recipients, each participant, was saving by moving out of the shelter faster. And what we saw was in 1 year, each cash recipient produced over $8,000 in cost savings than the non-cash participants. So if we subtract the cash transfer, which is $7,500, each participant produced a net savings of $700 more per year. So this suggests that the cash transfers can be a cost-effective approach for governments to reduce homelessness. So here's our summary. We're working in Vancouver, which is one of the most expensive cities in the world. We're working with the most impoverished people in this city with the highest rents and the lowest vacancy. But even so, we found that cash transfers reduced homelessness, increased savings and spending, and generated cost savings for society over 1 year. We did not see increase in spending on temptation goods among the recipients, and the cash transfers can be a cost-effective approach to reduce homelessness. So the tentative policy recommendation here was to distribute the $7,500 to recently homeless individuals without severe substance use, alcohol use, or psychiatric symptoms. So that's the policy recommendation from our work. Now over to you, Alice, to talk about how the public have received this study so far.
Thanks, Jiaying. So we obviously had a degree of uncertainty before we released the results. We couldn't fully predict, how the world was going to react. However, we had an overwhelmingly positive response from all kinds of well-known media and press outlets, not just in Canada and the US, but all over the world. And yeah, really honing in not just on the kind of tangible results, but really the way that some of the findings were kind of challenging really widespread harmful misperceptions about people experiencing homelessness. And one thing I just wanted to emphasize, especially for this presentation, was just that, again, the kind of interdisciplinary nature of the team really worked in our favor and gave us a lot of strength when we were communicating the findings out there to the press, because we had Claire, our co-founder and CEO at the time, who could really speak powerfully at a high level to kind of why the results were important in a societal, wider context. We had Jiaying, who was able to speak to the research specifics and really gave a high level of credibility to the work. And then we actually had Ray, who was a participant who received a cash transfer. And he is a fantastic public speaker and spokesperson and was able to speak very directly to the impact that the cash transfer had in his life, which was extremely powerful. And so everyone was really trained to speak about the key messages, but all really brought their own kind of color and background to it. So that was a really good example of how we work together, I think. Really where our focus is now is expanding this work. We are really inspired and compelled by the positive signals that Jiaying's spoken to that came from the pilot data, and really want to continue advocating for unconditional cash transfers. That's really in line with what our model is around pilot to policy, which is really about taking these kind of innovative new ideas, piloting them, scaling them, growing the evidence base, and then being able to actually take that evidence and advocate for those policy changes at a government level. So our intention is to increase the sample size to a total of 400 individuals. So as you can see here, it will be 200 will receive the cash transfer and 200 will not. And we've just simplified the research design there. We increased the amount of cash to 8,500 Canadian dollars. And that was just in line with an increase in the BC income assistance. We'll also be providing a revised set of non-cash supports to everyone in the study. So all 400 participants will receive a free smartphone and a data plan for 1 year. They'll have access to a project app, which will really increase the connection to the members of the team and hopefully kind of decrease some of the attrition that we saw in the pilot. And we'll have kind of one-to-one follow-ups. Everyone will still receive a bank account. We're still working with Van City, and participants will continue to receive honorarium for the follow-up points. And then we'll be, again, evaluating as we did in the pilot around those key outcome measures. And again, I just want to emphasize in terms of co-leadership and working together, I think the way that we worked together in the pilot has really carried through to how we redesigned the expansion project. Again, we met regularly and really brought all kinds of different perspectives to look at the lessons learned from the pilot and think about what we wanted to do differently. We also established a lived experience advisory panel, which is a few people from the pilot, including Ray. And so, yeah, really feeding in all different backgrounds and perspectives.
Yeah. So these are the key takeaways that Alice already touched on. I will do another wrap up at the end of the session, but yeah, I would love to hear your questions at this point. So I want to thank our team again and our funders. So back to you, Scott.
Thank you so much, Jiaying and Alice. That's such an inspiring project, and you did a really good job of giving us an overview. I wanted to start out by asking a little bit about the basic research aspect of this project. It's obvious, what the societal takeaways are, and clear that there have been some preliminary discoveries from the pilot project. But I wonder if it's possible for you to talk about the new knowledge that has resulted from this project and how that has been shared in an academic sense. And I don't know if you both want to speak to that, or Jiaying, if that's more in your territory.
Yeah, I think the new knowledge generated from the study was the reduction in homelessness. We pre-registered the study on Open Science Framework before data collection, and we all made our bets in terms of what results will come out, what we think will be the most likely results. And we made our bets based on past literature, mostly studies from Gift Directly that basically tested unconditional cash transfers in Kenya and other developing countries. And so those findings suggest that cash transfers increase subjective well-being. People felt better. They actually are more satisfied with their life. There were increases in spending on food, on durable goods, and no increases on spending on temptation goods. So these are the kind of the key findings from the developing world. That's how we pre-registered our study before we started data collection. Turns out that was only partly true. And the most surprising finding was, to me at least, was a reduction in days homeless. The reason of my initial hesitation was that it was so hard to find housing in Vancouver. The rent was high and the vacancy was low. So I did not expect the cash transfer to have an immediate impact on days homeless. In fact, we also saw a marginal increase in days in stable housing. So basically, there's time in the shelter, there's time in transitional housing, in institutional housing, and eventually in stable housing. So the different forms of housing. And we actually saw a marginal increase in stable housing as well in this study. So I think that was a piece of new knowledge that we can add to the literature, at least the academic literature, in terms of what can reduce homelessness. To me, that's the valuable lesson here.
Thank you, Jiaying. I see a few people are asking some questions about some of the technical aspects of the study. For instance, there's a question about the time series plots and the issue of the sustainability or persistence of the results experienced by the project participants. So someone's asking if by the end of 12 months, some of the positive effects may have decreased or disappeared. And so the question is, one, are the results persistent and sustainable? And secondly, is there some seasonality at play in the effects of the cash distribution?
Yeah, these are great questions. So in terms of sustainability, we do see a diminishing effect at 12 months. This is because control participants eventually caught up. But I think that the most immediate effects were within the first 3 to 6 months. That's when we actually saw the biggest difference between the two groups. And I think that's also important. The reason being, every night on the street is costly. If we can get people off the street quicker, faster, that's not only cost savings, it also presents less opportunity for assault, for physical violence, for all kinds of other kind of consequences of being on the street. So, and in fact, just that the short-term effects of let's say fewer days homeless generated enough cost savings for society already, right? So that was significant. I think one thing is to say, well, what's the long-term impact of that? Well, at this point, I think we have 24 months or 2-year data for some participants. And again, you see some differences between cash and control, but the difference was no longer significant. So I have to say that the sample size was very small at 12 months, let alone 24 months. So that's another challenge to get any statistical significance there. But I think one way is to think about long-term effects, but also you have to look at the savings over time as well. And I think what we didn't measure was the kind of the spillover effects of being off the streets. We didn't systematically measure that. And that's something we're going to do in the expansion project. I think the tracking, for instance, community engagement and integration benefits family members of the recipient in addition to themselves. I think there are lessons to be drawn even from the short-term effects as well. These are meaningful effects. And yeah, I wish we could see more long-term effects, but that's just not the case at this point. It does not mean that the approach is not, valuable.
Thank you, Jiaying. I would like to ask some questions that are more specifically HIBAR related. And one of them is, how specifically the involvement of societal partners influenced the research design of this project. It's clear that there was a great deal of conversation early on in 2015. In fact, it seems, in fact, to have been initiated by Foundations for Social Change, and then the academics were brought in, to help develop the research component. But I'm wondering if you could delve a little bit more deeply into the research design and how the cooperation occurred between the academic partners and the societal partners.
So, yeah, you're right, Scott. There was really that initial period of the first time that kind of Claire went out into the community and pitched the idea to, especially to kind of significant community organization, to ask them as experts, is this something that you could see being beneficial to some of your clients? And that's where I think she really started to get a sense of who would actually come on board when we were able to kind of implement the project. And I think they were able to advise on what the best way might be to actually come in and interact with people in the shelters. And we had a lot of learnings even from the recruitment period in the pilot. And I can speak to this just because I did come in a little bit later in the project. What we did is when we started to plan for the expansion project, we kind of had some meetings with the partners. We actually got them all in a room together and said, well, look, here are the issues we had with the recruitment in the pilot. What are your ideas for how we could maybe mitigate some of these in the expansion project? And actually what we've done for the expansion project, if we're shifting to a slightly different way of recruitment, where we're actually trying to engage the partners even more in referring clients and really kind of keying into them and saying, well, you're the experts and you have the experience with clients on the ground, so let's give you the information that you need about who we're looking for, and then you can really help us make sure that we're recruiting the right people and we're actually kind of increasing our efficiency, because as Jiaying said, that we screened in only about 30% of everyone that we kind of initially screened.
Thank you. And a related question is what specific steps you're taking to make sure that all of the research partners are engaged in the decision-making process of the project. And it sounds like particularly between the UBC researchers and Foundations for Social Change partners, very regular communication is a key part of that. Your weekly meetings and staying in touch. What about other partners in the project, the funders and others who are involved in supporting the project? How are they involved in this active communication process and perhaps in other ways in order to make sure that they're contributing effectively to any decision making?
I think in many ways it's similar to how we've interacted with the researchers. I think just through very consistent one-to-one communication and just creating the space for people to ask questions and honoring their position as experts. So it's not a one-way thing where we would send someone and say, this is what we're doing. It's really been approached as more of a conversation, especially with some of our longer term partners, to say, we're doing this again, this is what we're thinking of improvements that we can make. But thinking back to your experience of the pilot, is there anything else that you think we could build in? And then with new partners, we've really, I think, developed the communication materials that we're going to be providing people. So it's going to be much more of a formal package of, here's everything that you need to know, here are your points of contact. We're going to have a whole structured onboarding process so that when it comes to starting recruitment, our partners are really well informed, they're really on board with the process, and they've been able to have space to give feedback as well.
Much of what you've described so far, each of you, involves the successes that you've achieved up to this point. But I'm curious to know whether there are any barriers you've encountered that you didn't expect or that surprised you with regard to the collaboration. And if so, how did you overcome them?
Well, I can speak to one barrier, and I'm sure Alice can speak to several others. So I think the biggest challenge we faced in the New Leaf project was ethics approval. Just as a comparison, we spent 6 months working with UBC Ethics Board to get approval for this project, whereas the BC province gave us the permission to go ahead within 3 months. So it's just kind of a contrast in terms of how long things can take before we even start. And the barriers from ethics were, multitude. One is they thought the project was too risky. The cash transfer presented many risks to participants, and we developed a very thorough risk mitigation strategy. And I think that's the number one concern. There are other concerns like I'm actually in the middle of the same battle with ethics board for the expansion project at this point. So there's so many points that I'm still addressing for the expansion project. But I think that was also a learning exercise for us, which is how do you get academic institutional ethics approval? That was, I would say that is the most challenging part of the New Leaf project. And I think, insofar as we need to make sure that our project is ethical, equitable, and inclusive, we're holding our guiding principles that actually JEDI is justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. I think we also have to address or meet the concerns from the ethics board, which are far-ranging. So that's at least my biggest barrier. And over to you, Alice.
Yeah, I suppose the other major barrier that comes to mind is funding, which is probably an obvious one, but it is a significant barrier, and I think it comes partly from the issue that the challenge that everyone has is that funding is competitive, but another layer with this project is that it is still a new idea. It's a little bit controversial and can be perceived as high risk, and there is still a culture of unintentional, but distrust in the kind of philanthropy sector, in the government, where our project is not the most straightforward one to kind of advocate for funding for. And we've had some great successes, especially from funding bodies like, for example, the Vancouver Foundation, who are really well established and are actually really trying to push more for a kind of model of trust-based philanthropy. But at the same time, we've had a lot of challenges with provincial government, for example, who have been aware of our project, have been engaged because they gave us the exemption around the income assistance. But in terms of getting funding, we have had lots and lots of meetings, lots of presentations, and really without any kind of financial success. So that is something that we're working on. We're trying as a team to really flesh out more of a targeted government relations strategy. But again, as a small team with limited funding, it's challenging to do that. So that is kind of an ongoing barrier.
And picking up on the funding question, I wonder whether the sources of funding for the project influence the research design and implementation in any way.
The funding, I think, for the pilot came from the federal government. That's the not Tri-Council funding, which is a different government funding source, and a lot from private foundations. So I think that gave us they gave us quite a bit of freedom to execute the project as we see fit, instead of complying with very specific expectations. And I don't think this work is easily fundable by Tri-Council, which is, so basically this is like the NIH and SF equivalent in Canada, SHRC, which we call SHRC and CERC and CHR. I think because of the high risk aspect of this project, it's just not, Tri-Council is not going to be, we tried, but we weren't successful at that. So I think I as far as I can see, the source of the funding did not limit the research component. And Alice, over to you.
Yeah, I would agree. I wouldn't say that we've had any direct experiences so far where we really had to change the design. We put it forward what we're doing, and that's what we're kind of asking for funds for. Sometimes there are specifics perhaps around outcomes that some funders are particularly interested in, which is, I think, fairly common anyway. But that's where I think we actually have quite a big strength, especially FSC as a charity applying. That's where our partnership with UBC is a massive to say that we're working with academic research partners to really rigorously evaluate this. So I think that has actually acted as a strength on many of our funding applications.
Mm-hmm. So a broader question, the topic of this work garners considerable public and political interest. And I'm curious to know whether this high level of public interest affected the project in any way. Did it influence the research design? Has it made the study more or less difficult to conduct?
So for the pilot, we didn't have too many of those issues, because we were not public when we did the pilot, and even within the study we were operating under a cover story. But absolutely, it was a huge conversation that we then had to have about the expansion project, because we will be launching that having now had quite a significant amount of press. So it has been a kind of consideration, and we've really had to explore, how do we get the balance of not operating under a full cover story, but not saying so much that we are inundated at a recruitment kind of phase. And also, we have to think about how it might invalidate some of the ways that people respond to screening questions, and how do we manage that. So again, I think it's come down to sort of working with partners as well, and getting their advice. And I think we've reached a point where we're kind of looking at doing a partial disclosure. And maybe Jiaying can speak more.
Yeah, I think governments around the world have been very interested in a project and expansion as well. We've been advising a couple of pilots that were spurred by our New Leaf project. I don't think the government, the top-down input is, influencing our design, because we have a pretty good idea of what to do next. And we're still getting support from the provincial government, for instance. They're continuing the kind of the policy permission for us. And I think I just talked to the city of Minneapolis, and I talked to a representative from Minnesota, and they just informed me that, for instance, the state of Indiana just passed a law that allows cash transfer projects to happen while preventing the benefit cliffs. So I think that's an important policy advancement just recently. And I think I want to see more of that in Canada and the US and other countries. So basically, we need to make policies more lenient for these studies to happen.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. How about one last question before we turn back to you for some final takeaways? And this has to do with the need to publish the work from this study in the academic literature. And have you experienced any challenges in balancing the effort needed to prepare publications and the effort needed in maximizing the societal impact of the work? Or has it been possible to balance those two fairly easily?
Well, I think the two go hand in hand. I don't see a significant trade-off between the two. If it has important societal implications, then it should be published in an academic journal. Now, having said this, I do think there was a brief battle between scientific rigor and practicality. So for instance, I just remember the battle with ethics board was, why do you have to run it as a randomized control trial? Why can't you just give the cash and do it a pre-post comparison? And of course, running an RCT is more expensive. It actually involves more costs from FSC. And I had to make that case many times to say why we need an RCT as opposed to a pre-post comparison. So I think there are certain scientific standards that we need to withhold as academics, and that may be inconvenient for a lot of people. But I think our FSC is on board, our partners are on board. That's a battle worth fighting for.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And now I think we're at the point where we can give you a few more minutes to offer some final takeaways.
Great. So this is the last slide that Alice touched on before, which is the academic lesson was unconditional cash transfer can reduce homelessness, but for a very given specific type of individuals. I don't think this approach will work for everyone. And as Alice mentioned, that the joint partnership between academia, industry, NGO, and government is really key to this project, with this kind of project. And as an academic, what I can do is to provide the scientific rigor and support. And Alice, I think over to you on maybe the lived experience panel, the contributions they've made, for instance.
Yeah, so this has been one of the biggest learnings, just sort of between the pilot and developing the expansion, is really developing a group of people who bring expertise from their lived experience, and really starting to try and integrate their input and their knowledge into different kinds of decision making and project design. And we've kind of started building that up as we've revised the expansion project, but it's really become an increasingly central part of how we try and work. And so, yeah, I'm looking forward to developing that in the future and keeping it an important part of the work.
Great. And the final point is the pilot to policy approach. We want to ultimately inform public policy with scientific evidence. So I think that's the ultimate goal here.
Thank you so much, Jiaying and Alice, for that really interesting and helpful overview of this project, which I think is clearly already contributing positively to society, but also resulting in very useful discoveries for the scientific literature. So thank you for your presentation, and thanks very much to everyone who's attended today's webinar. Please stay tuned for announcements of future events in this series.